In the past few years, Minecraft has added a crossbow, a trident, a mace, and a spear, and almost nobody uses any of them. Not because they're bad weapons, but because Minecraft's combat system itself is flawed. That creates a much bigger problem that no one is talking about. Minecraft didn't just start with swords and bows, it was literally designed around them. And that very decision, made 15 years ago, is the reason almost every new weapon in Minecraft feels pointless today. Ever since the inclusion of hostile mobs to the game, there has been a need to fight them whenever night fell. In the earliest days of InDev, the only solution was your own two blocky fists, giving a zombie the good old left right goodnight. This wasn't very effective though. You don't do a lot of damage with your fists, and the knockback is notoriously bad. So Notch, in his limited wisdom, gave the player a new set of tools to get the job done: the sword and the bow. No longer were mobs dominating the overworld. We now have the ability to cut them down, and in the case of the earliest installment of the bow, mow them down like a machine gun, since knocking and drawing an arrow hasn't been invented at this point. Later implemented systems would revolve around these two weapons, and that was it. It would be years before other weapons would be added to compete with the sword and the bow. The problem with this, though, is that the game had set up these two as the only way to participate in combat so early on, and for such a long stretch of time, that anything else added later would fall to irrelevancy. Now, to be charitable, the sword and the bow would change numerous times throughout the years and through various versions of the game. A year after the addition of these two weapons, we would get the enchantment system in 1.0.0, which itself would get various changes. Swords can now have sharpness, smite, bane of anthropods, knockback, and fire aspect. Bows, of course, got their own set of enchantments, and yes, finally changed from instant fire to hold to draw, thus ending its terror as an assault rifle. The sword and bow would cement itself into the game's identity just as much as mining and crafting. It wouldn't be until 5 years later we would get the quote unquote combat update, which changed how swords worked yet again and added shields. If the sword wasn't locked down as the way to melee mobs, with the addition of the shield, there just was no room for a better combo. One of the things that I really loved about the shields was that it also allowed room for the axe to be more than just a tool for chopping trees. Axes had always been a semi viable choice for a melee weapon too, but it still didn't compete with the sword, an all too common trend. It was kind of cool though to be able to use the axe to do more damage to shields. I think that was a very welcome addition. 2 years later, in 2018, they would go on to finally add a new weapon. In the update Aquatic, they added the trident, 7 whole years after the addition of the sword. The following year, in 2019, we would get the bow's first rival, the crossbow. It seemed as though implementing new weapons would be a trend, yet, despite that, the next one, the mace, wouldn't come until 2024, followed by the spear in 2025. Can you sort of see the timeline here? All this is to show how players had long already established a sort of meta and developed habits around using the sword and bow. When a game trains its player base for an entire decade to fight in one specific way, adding anything new isn't really adding variety. It's fighting muscle memory. And that's the real problem with Minecraft's combat. For clarity's sake, let's take a look at every weapon that was added and kind of sort of sum them up. The angle they had for the crossbow is that it was intended to be a slower, heavier, and harder hitting bow. The reality is, it has a much slower DPS than the bow. Its enchantments are painfully worse, though the one pro that the crossbow has in regard to enchantments is its ability to utilize the multi shot enchantment, which allows it to fire 3 arrows in a horizontal spread, effectively turning it into a shotgun. While up close and personal, this works well if you nail all 3 of the shots. Still, though, unfortunately, in 90% of the scenarios that matter, the bow is just better. I'm not saying that the crossbow is bad. I'm just saying that it's the bow, but worse. The concept of the trident is cool, like really cool. And while I will say that with the right enchantments, underwater it can actually fare better for you than the sword in some cases. But that's where the usefulness ends. The cons are that a trident cannot be crafted. It's locked behind a rare drop from one specific mob, the drowned, which makes it frustrating to try to get. The trident's alt fire is that it can be held back and thrown, and it's just gone. Unless you have the loyalty enchantment, which puts kind of like a string on it that pulls it back to you. I guess to say that it's only useful in the water is a half truth, because it has a second situational use, and that's in the rain. When you have the enchantment Riptide, which allows you to dash around in the water, it can also be used in the rain when you have an Elytra. So it kind of loses its use as a weapon and becomes more of a niche mobility tool. At the end of the day, the Trident isn't really a weapon. It's a movement ability that sometimes does damage. And this is a pattern with every new weapon in Minecraft. I think out of all of the possibilities of weapons, the mace was the concept I'd wanted since day one, being that I'm a huge fan of Hammer and Warhammer weapons. Its intention was to be a heavy, vertical, skill based weapon, which is fantastic in concept. The caveat here is that it requires setup in order to be of any use. You have to rather rely on the fall damage gimmick where you drop in on an enemy and hope to God that you landed the hit, or that you use the little gust ball to get some vertical motion. In a practical sense, this thing is it's such an insane risk in survival. And in a game where dying can mean losing everything, nobody's going to pick the risky weapon. When a weapon requires this much setup to be useful, players will just default to using the sword. The spear is another gimmick weapon, though you can craft this one. Its intention was to be a longer reach weapon and, for some reason, try to entice the players to resort to mounted combat. The spear's gimmick is that you hold left click, it amplifies the damage dealt based on your current speed. This means that it's really more of a lance than it is a spear, considering this mechanic is more like jousting. This weapon is really good on horseback or with an elytra. The damage is great under those two circumstances, but that's pretty much it. It's really just a slower, weaker sword that has further reach. You can't use a shield with it either, which leaves it completely open to being shot by skeletons or other players. Unless faced with very, very specific situations where the spear can be useful, the sword beats it out, solely for its speed and ability to combo with a shield. Let me state too, I'm not the fun police. I don't think these are bad additions to the game. I don't think they need to be removed, and I think they're fun. I think the idea of every one of these things brings loads of fun to the game. I do think they could be changed a bit and rebalanced to give them more than just a single use, because the problem isn't really the weapons themselves. Let's zoom out a bit and take a look at the game as a whole. Based on the way weapons have been implemented during the game's lifetime, it seems clear that there's an overall problem that isn't being addressed or handled by Mojang. They add new weapons without much thought about the practicality or future of said weapons. They're putting a band aid on a larger wound. They add weapons, but never redesign the system those weapons are forced to exist in. As a player, your choices are sword and shield, and maybe keeping a spear or trident handy in case the need arises for it. Um, it probably won't, though. Jeb, the chief creative officer and lead designer slash developer of Minecraft, has hinted in the past that some kind of overhaul of the combat system is in the works. As of now, though, there hasn't been any follow through or update about it, so only time will tell if it's still being worked on or if it even fixes anything at all. Minecraft doesn't have a weapon problem. It has a combat system that was designed so tightly around swords and bows that it literally can't evolve without breaking itself. If Mojang wants anyone to use any of these weapons, they need to finally redesign Minecraft's combat. That's the takeaway. One simple fix I could think of would be to implement some sort of slash, pierce, blunt damage system that also has a similar resistance mechanic to match. Just use the KISS method here. Keep it simple, stupid. Or, instead of an upgrade, perhaps a side grade. What about introducing some sort of small skill tree that works in tandem with the enchantment system? If anything, maybe at the very least, find some way for the sword to be less dominating. I say this as it appears to be a trend that any additional weapons will suffer the same fate. Have a gimmick, have a situational use, but ultimately be overall a worse practical choice to the sword or bow. Anyway, I'm curious what you guys think. Am I out of pocket here, or am I on the money? And be honest here. Let me know down below the last time you chose, say, the trident over the sword on a serious survival world. And if you do actually use one of these weapons regularly, I genuinely want to know why. All right, catch y'all next time.